Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially from the people who were supposed to protect you, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd have to explain ownership of their own home to their parents, let alone to a sibling who had always been favored without apology. But life has a way of humbling you in the most personal ways. I'm the older one, the responsible one, the child who learned early that love in our house was measured by usefulness and silence, and for most of my life I wore both like a second skin. My brother, Daniel, was different. He was loud, charming, always falling and always being caught before he hit the ground. If there was a choice between us, my parents chose him and explained it away as "he needs us more," a phrase that followed me well into adulthood like a quiet dismissal. The house at the center of all this wasn't some grand estate, just a modest two-story place on a corner lot with a stubborn oak tree out front, but it represented the first thing I ever truly owned. I bought it 10 years ago after saving for what felt like a lifetime, and I did it quietly, without fanfare, because that's how I learned to survive in my family, by not drawing attention to anything that mattered to me. The down payment came from my own savings, years of overtime and skipped vacations, and the mortgage was in my name alone. My parents had helped once, long ago, with advice and a small loan I paid back within a year, but somehow in their memory, that had grown into a story where the house was family property, something flexible, something communal, something they could decide the fate of. I didn't know that story had taken root until the afternoon I came home early from work, exhausted and looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening, and saw my parents' car in my driveway along with Daniel's truck. I remember thinking it was odd, but not alarming, because surprise visits were common, boundaries less so. I unlocked my door and walked into a scene that felt staged without my consent. My mother on my couch, my father standing by the window, Daniel leaning against the counter with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. They all turned to look at me like I was late to my own meeting. My mother spoke first, in that soft, final tone she used when decisions had already been made. She said, "We were just talking about the house." I smiled, polite and tired, and said something harmless like, "Oh yeah?" and set my bag down. That's when my father cleared his throat and said, "We've decided it's time to put things right." He explained, slowly and confidently, that Daniel needed stability, that his lease was ending, that starting a family required space, and that this house, my house, was perfect. He said it as if listing features in a brochure. 2 bedrooms upstairs, quiet street, good schools nearby. My mother nodded along, adding that it made sense to keep it in the family, and that I, being single and so capable, could always find another place. Daniel finally spoke, clapping his hands together like this was a celebration, and said, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of it." I remember the room feeling smaller, the air thicker, like I was underwater listening to people talk through glass. I asked very calmly, "What do you mean, take care of it?" My father frowned, confused by my confusion, and said, "We're giving Daniel the house. We'll handle the paperwork." The word paperwork echoed in my head, absurd and loud, because there was paperwork already, paperwork they'd never seen, paperwork that said my name in black ink. I looked at my mother, hoping for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, but she just smiled sadly and said, "We know this is hard, but family comes first." In that moment, a lifetime of swallowed protests pressed against my chest, but I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I asked one simple question. "When did you think this house stopped being mine?" There was a pause, awkward and revealing. Daniel shifted his weight. My parents exchanged a look. My mother said, "Well, we helped you in the beginning, and you've always known this was meant to stay with the family." It was astonishing how confidently she rewrote my life. I felt something settle inside me then, a quiet clarity. I told them we needed to talk, really talk, and that there was something they should understand before any decisions were made. My father waved a hand dismissively and said, "We'll sort it out with the lawyer next week." That's when I said it, gently but firmly. You can't give away what you don't legally own. The words landed differently than anything else I'd said that day. My brother laughed first, a short disbelieving sound, but my father's face tightened. He asked me what I meant, and I told him the truth, that the deed was in my name, that the mortgage was mine, that the house was and had never been theirs to give. Silence fell heavy and sharp. My mother blinked like she'd misheard me. Daniel straightened, his grin gone. My father asked to see proof, his voice edged with authority that no longer worked on me, and I told him I'd show him, but that it wouldn't change the reality they were refusing to see. As I walked to my desk to retrieve the folder I kept for moments exactly like this, I realized how prepared I'd been without knowing it, how some part of me had always expected the people I loved to test the limits of what I'd built for myself. I didn't feel victorious or smug, just deeply tired and strangely calm, because the truth, once spoken, has a way of standing on its own. I laid the documents out on the table, each page a quiet witness, and watched as my parents' certainty began to crumble, replaced by something closer to shock. Daniel didn't say a word. My mother whispered my name like a question, and in that stillness, I understood that this wasn't just about a house. It was about years of being overlooked, about finally being seen not as an extension of family needs, but as a person with rights, boundaries, and a life of her own. The papers sat between us like a fragile ceasefire, edges curling slightly from age, my name printed clearly where my parents expected to see theirs. My father picked one up, adjusting his glasses as if better vision might change the words, and my mother leaned in, her hand hovering over the table without touching anything, like she was afraid the truth might bite. Daniel finally broke the silence with a scoff, saying this had to be some kind of technicality, that families didn't work like this, that paperwork was just paperwork. I watched him closely then, not with anger but with a strange detachment, noticing how easily he dismissed something that had taken me a decade to build. My father cleared his throat again, slower this time, and asked why they'd never known. I told him they had known once when I signed the papers and invited them over to celebrate with takeout because I couldn't afford anything else. I reminded them of the night I'd shown them the keys, how my mother had hugged me and said she was proud. Memory flickered across her face, but it didn't fully land. She said things had been so busy back then that it was hard to keep track, and that besides, intentions mattered more than documents. That was when I felt the old reflex rise in me, the urge to smooth things over, to apologize for upsetting the balance, but I let it pass. I told her intentions didn't pay property taxes or sign mortgage agreements. My father sighed, rubbing his temples, and said this was becoming unnecessarily complicated. He suggested a compromise, something fair, where Daniel could live here for a while and I could stay elsewhere until things settled. The word fair tasted bitter. I asked him quietly where fairness had been when Daniel moved back home for the third time without paying rent, when my college fund had quietly disappeared to cover his debts, when my achievements were treated like expected chores rather than milestones. The room shifted then, discomfort settling in. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she said she hated conflict, that all she ever wanted was for her children to be close. I believed her, but I also knew closeness, to her, had always meant compliance. Daniel stood up, pacing, his voice rising as he accused me of being selfish, of choosing money over family. I told him it wasn't about money, that it was about respect, about being asked instead of told, about acknowledging that my life wasn't a backup plan for his. He stopped pacing and stared at me like he didn't recognize me, and in a way he didn't. I was different now, not louder or crueler, just clearer. My father asked what I wanted, and the simplicity of the question surprised me. I said I wanted my home respected, my boundaries honored, and an apology, not for wanting help, but for assuming entitlement. Silence answered me again, longer this time. My mother finally spoke, her voice small, and said she never meant to hurt me. I nodded and told her intent didn't erase impact, but it was a start. Daniel muttered that this was unbelievable, that he'd already told his girlfriend they were moving in. I told him I was sorry he'd made plans without confirmation, but that wasn't my responsibility to fix. The conversation dragged on, looping through old grievances and half-remembered favors until exhaustion dulled the edges. Eventually, my parents gathered their things, leaving the papers exactly where they were, as if afraid to move them. At the door, my father turned and said we'd talk again after everyone cooled down. I said okay, because it was easier than saying what I really thought, that cooling down wouldn't change the facts. When the door closed, the house felt different, quieter but heavier, like it was holding its breath. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the wood grain, feeling a mix of grief and relief. Standing up for myself hadn't felt triumphant, it felt necessary, like setting a bone that had been crooked for years. Over the next few days, messages trickled in. My mother sent long texts about family and forgiveness, carefully avoiding the word sorry. My father left a voicemail suggesting mediation. Daniel sent nothing, which somehow hurt and reassured me at the same time. Friends I confided in reacted with disbelief, then anger on my behalf, and one of them gently suggested I consult a lawyer just in case. I did, not because I doubted my ownership, but because I'd learned that clarity was protection. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew and advised me to keep records of all communications. Hearing it from a stranger made it feel more real, less like a family argument and more like a line I was allowed to draw. A week later, my parents asked to meet at a cafe, neutral ground. I arrived early, hands wrapped around a mug I didn't really want, and watched them approach together, older somehow than I remembered. We talked calmly this time. My father admitted they'd assumed the house would revert to them eventually, that in their minds it had always been a shared asset. I told him assumptions didn't transfer ownership. My mother cried and said she felt like she was losing her family. I told her I felt like I'd been lost for a long time already. There was a pause, then something shifted. My father said they'd made a mistake. It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer than I'd ever heard. Daniel didn't come to the meeting, and I realized that might be its own answer. We agreed on boundaries moving forward, on asking instead of deciding, on acknowledging my autonomy even when it was uncomfortable. When we stood to leave, my mother hugged me longer than usual, and I let myself lean into it, not because everything was fixed, but because some things had finally been named. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter and sadder all at once. The house was still mine, steady and unchanged, but the family I thought I had was different now, more fragile, more honest. That night, I sat on my porch under the oak tree and thought about how ownership isn't just about deeds and documents, but about claiming your place in the world without apology. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again shrink to fit someone else's expectations, not even for love. In the weeks after that cafe meeting, life settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that feels temporary even when days keep passing. My parents stopped by less often, and when they did, they called first. That alone told me how deeply that afternoon had rattled them. Boundaries, once set, have a way of making everyone aware of how often they were crossed before. I spent more time noticing my house again. The creak on the third stair, the way afternoon light pooled in the living room, small details I'd overlooked while worrying about what might be taken from me. At night, though, my thoughts drifted back to Daniel. Growing up, I'd been his shield more times than I could count, stepping in when he forgot responsibilities or broke promises, smoothing things over so my parents wouldn't worry. Somewhere along the way, that protection turned into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. I wondered if he felt betrayed or simply inconvenienced, and the not knowing gnawed at me more than his silence. A month passed before he finally called. His voice was stiff, defensive, like he'd rehearsed the conversation. He said he didn't think it was right that I'd embarrassed our parents, that family matters shouldn't involve lawyers or documents. I listened, letting him finish, then told him calmly that the embarrassment came from assumptions, not from truth. I said I loved him, but loving him didn't mean surrendering my life to keep his comfortable. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might soften, but instead he said maybe we needed some space. I told him that was okay. Hanging up, I felt a familiar ache, but also a surprising steadiness, as if agreeing to space was another way of choosing myself. My parents tried, in their own imperfect way, to repair what they'd broken. My father dropped by one Saturday with coffee and an awkward smile, asking if I needed help fixing the fence. As we worked side by side, he admitted he'd always assumed I'd be fine, that I was strong enough to adapt, and that he hadn't realized how much that assumption had cost me. I told him strength shouldn't be mistaken for endless capacity. He nodded, quieter than usual, and for the first time I felt like he was really hearing me. My mother took longer. She oscillated between guilt and justification, between tears and reminders of all she'd sacrificed. One afternoon, I gently told her that sacrifice didn't give anyone the right to rewrite my boundaries. She cried, but she didn't argue, and that felt like progress. Slowly, our conversations became less about the house and more about us, about learning how to relate without old roles dictating everything. I won't pretend it was smooth. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns resurfaced, but each time I named them instead of swallowing them, and each time it got a little easier. The house became a symbol in ways I hadn't expected. Friends joked about it being the place that caused a family uprising, but to me it was proof that I could build something solid and defend it without losing my humanity. One evening, months later, my parents invited me to dinner. Daniel was there too, tense and distant. The meal was polite, careful. At one point, my father mentioned that Daniel and his girlfriend had found an apartment nearby. Daniel glanced at me, then looked down at his plate and muttered that it was temporary. I said I hoped it worked out for them. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment I saw not anger but uncertainty, the discomfort of standing without a safety net he'd always assumed would be there. After dinner, as I was leaving, he stopped me and said quietly that he hadn't known how much pressure I'd carried for so long. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's the first crack where light gets in. Driving home, I realized how much it changed, not just externally, but inside me. I no longer felt responsible for managing everyone else's feelings. I could care without controlling, love without erasing myself. The oak tree in my yard was shedding leaves by then, and I spent an afternoon raking them, thinking about how roots can be deep and tangled without choking the space around them. Family, I learned, is like that, healthy only when each part has room to grow. The moral of all this isn't about winning or proving a point. It's about remembering that your life is yours, even when people you love forget that. Standing up for myself didn't destroy my family. It forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years. Some relationships grew stronger, others changed shape, and a few remained strained, but all of them became more honest. On quiet nights, sitting in my living room with the windows open, I feel gratitude, not just for the house, but for the lesson it taught me. Ownership, I've learned, is as much about claiming your worth as it is about holding a deed. And once you do, the world and the people in it have to adjust. After that dinner, something subtle but important shifted in the rhythm of our family. It wasn't warmth exactly, not the easy kind we'd never really mastered anyway, but it was honesty, and honesty has weight. It sits heavier at first, presses on old bruises, but it also keeps things from floating away into denial. I noticed it in the way my parents spoke to me now, with more care, fewer assumptions. My father started asking instead of telling. My mother hesitated before offering opinions about my life, like she was testing unfamiliar ground. And Daniel, for the most part, stayed quiet. That silence used to feel like punishment, but now I understood it differently. It was him recalibrating, learning what it meant not to be automatically rescued. Meanwhile, I was learning what it meant to live without bracing myself for the next demand. The house felt more like home than ever. I repainted the spare room, planted herbs along the back fence, did small things I'd postponed because some part of me feared permanence, feared that if I settled too deeply, it would all be taken away. Letting go of that fear felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. One afternoon, my mother stopped by with a box of old photos she'd found while cleaning. We sat at the kitchen table, flipping through images of birthdays and holidays, moments that looked happier than they felt at the time. She pointed to one of Daniel and me as kids, me with my arm around his shoulders, and said she'd always been grateful I looked out for him. I told her I had and that I'd done it willingly, but that I couldn't be his safety net forever. She nodded, eyes glossy, and said she saw that now. It wasn't a grand confession, but it mattered. Not all realizations arrive with drama. Some slip in quietly and change the furniture of your heart. As the months passed, Daniel's life grew more complicated without my parents smoothing the edges. He called once, frustrated about money, and for a moment I felt the old urge to fix it. Instead, I listened and asked questions, offering empathy without solutions. He sounded surprised, maybe even disappointed, but when we hung up, I felt strangely proud of both of us. My parents noticed the change too. My father remarked one day that Daniel seemed to be growing up. I didn't say anything, but I thought about how growth often comes disguised as struggle. Around the holidays, tensions flared again. Old habits die hard, especially under stress. My mother suggested hosting Christmas at my place, casually mentioning how nice it would be for everyone to gather there again. The word again made my shoulders tighten. I took a breath and said I wasn't ready for that I'd prefer something smaller this year. There was a pause, then a sigh, but no argument. We compromised on dinner at their house instead. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. That night, lying in bed, I realized how far I'd come from the person who would have said yes just to avoid discomfort. Choosing myself no longer felt like an act of rebellion. It felt like maintenance. At Christmas dinner, Daniel pulled me aside and said he'd been thinking a lot about what happened. He admitted he'd taken my support for granted, that he'd assumed I'd always land on my feet so he wouldn't have to. His voice cracked when he said he hadn't realized how lonely that must have been for me. I didn't rush to reassure him or minimize it. I let the truth stand between us, solid and real. I told him it had been lonely, but that acknowledging it now meant something. We hugged, awkwardly, and it wasn't a clean resolution, but it was honest. Driving home that night, snow dusting the windshield, I felt a quiet sense of closure settling in. Not an ending, but a resting point. The house glowed when I pulled into the driveway, lights warm against the cold, and I thought about how close I'd come to losing not just a place, but myself. What stayed with me most wasn't the shock of my parents' assumption or the conflict that followed, but the lesson underneath it all, that people will often define your limits for you if you don't. They'll mistake your resilience for availability, your silence for consent. Standing up doesn't have to mean standing against. Sometimes it just means standing firm. I don't know what our family will look like years from now. Relationships aren't fixed objects. They're living things, always changing. But I know this version of me, the one who knows what she owns, what she deserves, and what she's willing to give, is here to stay. And every time I unlock my front door, I'm reminded that claiming your life is an ongoing act, one that begins the moment you decide you're worth protecting. By the time spring rolled around, the tension that had once lived in my chest like a constant hum had softened into something manageable, almost quiet. Not gone, exactly, but no longer running my life. I noticed it in small ways, how I slept through the night more often, how I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before seeing my parents, how the house no longer felt like something I had to guard every minute. It simply was mine, and that certainty settled into me deeper than I'd expected. My parents continued adjusting, awkwardly but earnestly. My father started asking about my work, really asking, listening instead of nodding distractedly. My mother caught herself mid-sentence more than once, stopping before offering unsolicited advice, then smiling sheepishly as if to say she was learning new rules in a language she'd spoken fluently for decades. I didn't punish them for the past, I let them practice the present. That choice, I realized, was as much for my peace as for theirs. Daniel's growth was slower and messier. He struggled in his new apartment, bounced between jobs, and occasionally let frustration leak into bitterness. But something fundamental had shifted. When he called now, it wasn't to ask me to intervene or fix things. It was to vent, to process, to sit in discomfort instead of escaping it. I could hear the difference in his voice, the unfamiliar weight of responsibility. One evening, he admitted he'd never really known who he was without everyone cushioning his falls. I told him that figuring it out was scary, but it was also freedom. He laughed softly and said he hoped so. I did too. The house itself seemed to breathe easier with me. I hosted friends without anxiety, filled rooms with laughter that wasn't performative, cooked meals just because I wanted to. I started a small ritual of sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky change, grounding myself in the life I'd built. Sometimes neighbors stopped to chat, and I felt woven into the neighborhood in a way I never had before. Stability, I learned, isn't boring when you've earned it, it's restful. Of course, not everything resolved neatly. There were still moments when old wounds flared unexpectedly. A comment from my mother about how family property should stay together sent a ripple through me one afternoon. I paused, met her eyes, and calmly said, "That idea hurt me before. Let's not go there again." She blinked, then nodded. No drama, no spiral, just a boundary held. After she left, I sat with the feeling, proud not because it was easy, but because it wasn't crushing anymore. Boundaries, when practiced, become muscle memory. One day, sorting through paperwork, I found the original closing documents for the house. I sat on the floor reading them again, remembering the younger version of myself who'd signed them with trembling hands, terrified and hopeful all at once. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her she was doing the right thing, that protecting herself didn't make her cold or selfish, that one day she'd thank herself for being brave in quiet ways. Maybe that's part of why this story matters to me now, not because of the conflict, but because of the growth it forced. My parents invited me to a family gathering that summer, a larger one with extended relatives. I hesitated, then agreed. At the event, I overheard my father correcting an aunt who referred to my house as the family place. He said firmly, "It's hers." The words hit me harder than I expected. I turned away quickly, blinking back tears, because acknowledgement, when it's genuine, can be overwhelming. Later, my mother squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me, not for accommodating, not for sacrificing, but for standing my ground. It felt like a small redemption, one I hadn't demanded but deeply appreciated. Daniel pulled me aside before I left and told me he was thinking about going back to school. He asked what I thought. I smiled and said I thought he'd figure it out just like I had. As I drove home, windows down, warm air filling the car, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that pretends everything is perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle imperfection without losing yourself. The house waited for me, steady and familiar, and as I stepped inside, I understood something clearly at last. The real inheritance I'd claimed wasn't property, it was autonomy. It was the right to define my life on my own terms, even when the people I loved resisted that definition. And that, I knew, was something no one could ever take from me again. By late summer, the story of the house had faded into the background of our conversations, no longer the sharp centerpiece, but a quiet reference point, like a scar that reminds you where you've been without hurting when you touch it. I noticed how differently my parents moved through my space now when they visited. They asked before opening cabinets, waited to be offered drinks, sat instead of roaming. Those small gestures carried more respect than any apology ever could. I didn't point it out. I let the change speak for itself. Respect, I'd learned, grows best when it's noticed but not audited. My relationship with my parents became something new, less automatic and more intentional. Phone calls shortened but deepened. We talked about real things, aging, fear, regrets, topics we'd once avoided in favor of logistics and expectations. My father admitted one evening that he worried about losing relevance as he got older, about no longer being needed. I understood then how easily need can masquerade as control, how giving away my house had felt to him like preserving a role he feared was slipping away. I told him he was needed, just not as an authority over my life. He smiled, a little sadly, and said he was learning that difference. My mother, in her own way, began confronting the identity she'd built around being indispensable. She volunteered more, found hobbies she'd long postponed, and sometimes called just to chat without an agenda. Hearing her laugh freely without the undercurrent of obligation softened something in me I hadn't realized was still guarded. Daniel's journey took another turn that fall. He lost his job unexpectedly and spiraled for a bit, frustration turning inward. He showed up at my door one night, not asking for money or rescue, just asking if he could sit and talk. We sat on the porch, the same place I'd spent so many evenings grounding myself, and he admitted how lost he felt. He said that when everything had been handed to him, he'd never learned how to stand when it wasn't. I listened, resisting the urge to give advice, and told him that learning late was still learning. He asked me how I'd managed all those years without leaning on anyone. I told him the truth, that I hadn't managed alone, that I'd leaned on myself so hard it sometimes hurt, and that independence wasn't the absence of support, but the ability to choose it. That seemed to land. He didn't leave magically transformed, but he left thoughtful, quieter than when he'd arrived. In the weeks that followed, he found temporary work, applied to school, and began piecing together a life that didn't depend on someone else's safety net. Watching him struggle without stepping in was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also one of the most loving. The house continued to anchor me. I hosted a small gathering to celebrate my birthday, something I'd avoided in the past out of a strange superstition that claiming joy would invite loss. Friends filled the rooms, music played softly, and laughter echoed against walls that had witnessed so much doubt. At one point, standing in the kitchen watching people I loved exist comfortably in my space, I felt a swell of gratitude so intense it almost knocked the breath out of me. Not for the house itself, but for the life it represented, the proof that I could build something lasting and protect it without burning everything else down. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the quiet and reflected on how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd stayed silent that first afternoon, if I'd let guilt override truth, I might have lost not just my home, but my sense of self. The realization wasn't frightening, it was empowering. It reminded me that speaking up, even when your voice shakes, can redirect the entire course of your life. As the year edged toward its end, my family gathered again, smaller this time, more deliberate. The conversations flowed more naturally. No one talked about the house, but its presence hovered as a reminder of what we'd all learned. My father toasted to growth. My mother toasted to honesty. Daniel raised his glass and said he was grateful for second chances. I didn't toast. I just smiled, letting their words settle. Driving home afterward, I thought about how families aren't broken by conflict as much as they're broken by avoidance.
We'd cracked something open, and while it had hurt, it had also let in air. At home, I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. I felt safe, not because nothing bad could happen, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever did. That trust, I realized, was the real foundation beneath my feet, and it had been built, brick by brick, the moment I decided my life was worth defending. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, not by erasing what happened, but by placing it in perspective. By the time winter returned, the house no longer felt like the center of a storm we'd all survived, but like a quiet witness to change. I found myself thinking less about the conflict itself and more about who I'd become because of it. The woman who once flinched at raised voices now held her ground calmly. The daughter who once measured love by compliance now understood that real love could withstand discomfort. Those shifts showed up everywhere, in my work, my friendships, even in the way I spoke to myself. My parents noticed too. My father remarked one evening that I seemed lighter, more confident. My mother said I sounded happier when I talked about my life. I was. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was finally aligned. Daniel's progress continued unevenly but honestly. He started classes at a community college, something he'd once dismissed, and called me one night, excited and nervous about his first exam. He didn't ask for help studying, he just wanted to share the moment. That, more than any apology, told me how far he'd come. Our relationship shifted into something more balanced, less weighted by unspoken obligations. We laughed more, argued less, and when we disagreed, it didn't feel like a threat to our bond. I stopped being his fallback plan, and in doing so, gave him the chance to become his own. The house, in its quiet way, kept teaching me lessons. I fixed things myself when I could, hired help when I couldn't, and learned to accept both as signs of competence, not weakness. One afternoon, as I replaced a broken light fixture, I thought about how often I'd been expected to fix emotional problems with no tools at all. Now, with clear instructions and the right support, even difficult repairs felt manageable. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. My parents invited me to join them on a short trip, something I'd usually declined out of habit. This time I said yes. Traveling together felt different without the undercurrent of control. They asked about my preferences, respected my pace, and even laughed when plans changed. At one point, my mother admitted she'd feared my independence meant she'd lose me. I told her independence had actually made it easier to choose connection because it wasn't forced. She squeezed my hand, thoughtful. That conversation alone made the trip worth it. Back home, I hosted a small dinner for my family. It was the first time I'd invited them all back since everything happened. As I set the table, I noticed my hands were steady. No rehearsed speeches, no contingency plans, just presence. The evening went smoothly. Conversation flowed, boundaries held, and when my father complimented the house, he did so with a tone of appreciation, not ownership. Daniel joked about how he'd once thought he'd lived there. We all laughed, and the laughter felt genuine, not brittle. After they left, I cleaned up slowly, savoring the quiet satisfaction of having chosen this moment on my terms. Later, lying in bed, I reflected on how the moral of my story had evolved. It wasn't simply that legal ownership matters, though it does. It was that clarity matters, that naming your truth, even when it disrupts others, can ultimately create healthier connections. Silence might keep the peace temporarily, but it rarely keeps the soul intact. Standing up for myself hadn't cost me my family, it had invited them to meet me as an equal. As another year approached, I made resolutions that had nothing to do with self-improvement in the traditional sense. I resolved to continue listening to my discomfort, to treat it as information rather than an enemy. I resolved to say no without over-explaining and yes without guilt. And I resolved to remember that the life I'd built was not a bargaining chip, but a foundation. On New Year's Eve, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching fireworks in the distance. The oak tree stood bare against the sky, strong and patient. I thought about roots again, about how they hold you in place while allowing you to grow upward. My family and I were still connected by those roots, but now there was space between us, healthy, necessary space. As the new year began, I felt ready for whatever came next, grounded in the knowledge that I could protect what mattered without losing what I loved.
As the new year unfolded, life didn't suddenly become a montage of victories or perfectly healed relationships. Instead, it settled into something quieter and more meaningful, a steady rhythm where effort and honesty mattered more than appearances. I noticed how often I checked in with myself now, asking what I actually wanted before agreeing to anything. That simple habit changed everything. Invitations felt lighter, obligations lost their grip. The house, still and solid, became a place not just of rest, but of intention. I started journaling in the mornings at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the pages, reflecting on how far I'd come and what still needed tending. Healing, I realized, isn't linear. It's a series of returns to the truth. My parents continued their slow recalibration. My father retired that spring, and with the end of his career came a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. He struggled with feeling unmoored, unsure of his place. One afternoon, he asked if we could talk. We sat in the living room, and he admitted he'd tied so much of his worth to providing and deciding that he hadn't known how to step back gracefully. He said giving away my house had felt, in his mind, like one last act of control disguised as generosity. Hearing him name it so plainly took my breath away. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that stepping back didn't make him less important, it made room for a different kind of relationship. He nodded, eyes wet, and said he hoped it wasn't too late to learn. I told him it wasn't. My mother's journey took its own shape. She joined a book club, something small but significant, and began forming friendships that didn't revolve around family. She talked about books with an excitement I'd never heard before, and I realized how much of herself she'd set aside over the years. Our conversations grew richer, less focused on logistics and more on thoughts and feelings. She apologized one evening, directly and without qualifiers, for assuming my life would always bend around the family's needs. I accepted it, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. Daniel's life gained momentum too. School challenged him, but he stuck with it, and each small success built confidence he'd never had to earn before. He thanked me once, awkwardly, for not letting him move into my house. He said it forced him to face himself. I laughed and told him he'd done the hard part. We began meeting for coffee occasionally, just the two of us, learning how to be siblings without the old scripts. Those moments felt like something new growing in the space where resentment used to live. The house itself saw new beginnings. I hosted a neighborhood gathering, something spontaneous and imperfect, and felt woven into a community beyond my family. Standing in my backyard, surrounded by conversation and warmth, I understood how claiming my space had allowed others to meet me there. Ownership had expanded my world instead of shrinking it. Of course, doubts still surfaced sometimes. Late at night, I wondered if I'd been too hard, if things could have been resolved with less conflict. But each time I returned to the truth. Avoiding conflict had only delayed it. Facing it had changed everything. One rainy afternoon, I found myself rereading old messages from that first week after the confrontation. The panic, the guilt, the second-guessing, it all felt distant now, like a storm I'd watched from shore after making it through. I closed my phone and looked around my living room, filled with evidence of a life lived deliberately. That perspective was its own reward. As spring turned to summer again, I marked the anniversary of the day I'd stood up for myself, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. I took a day off work, planted new flowers along the fence, and sat under the oak tree thinking about how that moment had set everything in motion. I didn't regret a single word I'd said. The moral of my story had crystallized into something simple but profound. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow.
When I allowed my life to be decided for me, that's what happened. When I claimed it, others had no choice but to adjust. Family love didn't disappear when I drew boundaries, it evolved. And in that evolution, I found not just peace, but a deeper, truer connection to them and to myself.
By the time another summer arrived, the house felt less like the setting of a story and more like a quiet constant, something I no longer needed to think about to appreciate. It had done its work in a way. It had forced conversations that might never have happened otherwise, and had given me a solid place to stand while everything else shifted. I noticed how rarely I felt the urge to defend myself now. The need had faded as my confidence settled into something durable. When disagreements came up, with family or anyone else, I met them with clarity instead of apology. That change rippled outward, touching every part of my life. My parents seemed to accept the new normal fully. They still stumbled occasionally, but they corrected themselves without prompting. One afternoon, my mother mentioned that she'd almost told a friend about our house, then stopped and laughed, catching herself. We laughed together, and the moment passed without tension. My father started asking my advice more often, treating me less like a child and more like a peer. It felt strange at first, then affirming. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty had become the currency I valued most. Daniel reached a milestone that fall when he completed his first year of school. He invited us all to a small celebration at his apartment. Standing in his space, modest and clearly his, I felt a swell of pride I hadn't expected. He'd built something from the ground up, and it showed. During dinner, he toasted me, thanking me for forcing him to grow up. I shook my head, smiling, and said he'd done the work himself, but inside I felt a quiet satisfaction, not because I'd denied him something, but because I'd trusted him enough not to save him. That trust had changed both of us. The house continued to host moments of reflection. One evening, sorting through a drawer, I found an old note I'd written myself years ago, back when I was first buying the place. It said simply, "This is for you." I sat on the floor and cried, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. I'd kept that promise even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. As my parents aged, conversations about the future became more open. They asked about my plans, my hopes, without attaching expectations. I shared honestly, knowing my answers wouldn't be repurposed into obligations. That freedom was new and precious. We talked about what support might look like as they grew older, and for the first time, those discussions felt collaborative instead of assumed. We were learning how to care for each other without erasing anyone in the process. I realized then how often families confuse closeness with control and how rare it is to untangle the two. The oak tree out front had grown fuller over the years, its branches casting wider shade. I often sat beneath it, thinking about roots and growth, about how strength doesn't always look like holding on. Sometimes it looks like letting go and trusting what remains. The moral lesson of my story sharpened with time. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors with locks you control. They allow you to invite people in without handing them the keys to your life. When I finally understood that, everything else fell into place. Looking back, I don't resent my parents for what they tried to do, nor my brother for what he expected. I understand now that they were operating from old patterns, from fears they hadn't named. But understanding doesn't require surrender, it just provides context. The real victory wasn't keeping my house, it was keeping myself. On the anniversary of that first confrontation, I lit a candle and sat quietly, honoring the version of me who'd spoken up when it mattered. I whispered a thank you to her, to the courage that had carried me through discomfort into something better. The house stood silent around me, solid and unassuming, a testament to what can happen when you claim your worth. And as I looked toward the future, I felt ready, not because I knew what would come, but because I trusted myself to meet it, grounded in truth and unafraid to stand alone if necessary.
As years passed, the story of the house became something I carried lightly, no longer a wound or even a warning, but a quiet compass that guided my choices. I noticed how often people in my life, friends, coworkers, even acquaintances, shared their own stories of blurred boundaries and unspoken expectations once they heard mine. It seemed to give them permission to question their own patterns, and in that way, what I'd lived through rippled outward in ways I'd never anticipated. The house wasn't just a personal milestone anymore. It was a reminder that clarity can be contagious. My parents grew older, softer in some ways, more reflective in others. My father took up woodworking, crafting small, imperfect pieces he gifted with pride. One day, he brought me a handmade shelf for the living room. As he mounted it, carefully measuring and adjusting, he said he liked knowing it would live in my house, that it felt right. The way he said "my house" mattered. My mother visited more often, not to manage or direct, but to share stories, to laugh, to simply be present. Our relationship felt more like friendship now, layered with history but no longer trapped by it. Daniel graduated and found steady work, something he celebrated with cautious optimism. At his graduation dinner, he thanked our parents for supporting him and then looked at me and said, "And thank you for believing I could stand on my own." I met his gaze and nodded, emotion tightening my throat. That belief had been hard-won on both sides. The house continued to witness change. I redecorated, renovated, made it increasingly my own. Each improvement felt like an affirmation, not just of ownership, but of agency. I invited my parents over to see the changes, and they admired without commentary, a small but meaningful shift from the past. I realized how far we'd all come when my mother asked before rearranging a chair and laughed at herself for even thinking of doing otherwise. The moral lesson crystallized fully for me one quiet afternoon as I sat alone, sunlight warming the room. We don't lose people by standing up for ourselves. We lose ourselves by not doing so. The fear that had once kept me silent, the fear of being unloved, of being seen as difficult, had been misplaced. The love that survived my honesty was the love worth keeping. Everything else had been conditional, and conditions, I learned, are not the same as care. As my parents' needs increased with age, our conversations about support were grounded in mutual respect. We planned together, acknowledging limits and capacities without guilt. I offered what I could, not because I was expected to, but because I chose to. That choice made all the difference. Daniel, too, learned to ask for help without entitlement, a skill that transformed his relationships. Watching him navigate adulthood with humility and resilience filled me with a quiet pride. On a crisp autumn evening, we gathered at my house once more, celebrating no milestone in particular. As we sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter, I felt a sense of completeness I hadn't known before. Not perfection, but alignment. The house held us all comfortably, not as a prize or a bargaining chip, but as a backdrop to a family that had learned, imperfectly, how to grow. Later, after everyone left, I walked through each room, turning off lights, pausing to take in the life I'd built. I thought about how easily this could have ended differently if I'd chosen silence over truth. The gratitude I felt was deep and steady, like the foundation beneath my feet. The lesson I carry forward is simple and enduring. Know what you own, know who you are, and don't let anyone, no matter how close, convince you to give either away. That knowledge has shaped every choice since, and it will continue to guide me long after the details of this story fade. The years that followed were quieter, gentler, and yet profoundly full. The house, once a battlefield of assumptions and entitlement, had become a sanctuary, a place where my life unfolded on my own terms. I realized how much my relationship with space mirrors our relationship with people, how boundaries shape connection, how ownership of self is inseparable from the respect others give us. My parents, now in the later stages of life, visited often, but our interactions were different. They didn't come to assert authority or to check in under the guise of care. Instead, they came to share, to laugh, and sometimes just to sit with me in silence, acknowledging the life I'd carved out for myself. I watched them aging gracefully, aware of their vulnerabilities, and I learned to offer support without sacrificing my own autonomy. Those were delicate lessons for all of us. Daniel's life continued to unfold in a way that surprised him. He moved into a home of his own, furnished it carefully, and filled it with the little habits that made a space truly his. He called me often to talk about his small victories, the way he'd balanced work and school, the friends he'd made, the mistakes he'd survived. And each time I listened, offering support without interference, guiding without controlling. It struck me often how differently he now approached the world. He had learned, the hard way, that nothing worth keeping comes without effort. He had also learned that my refusal to give in hadn't been cruelty, it had been an opportunity. The house, quiet and steady, held these changes like a witness. I found joy in mundane moments, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea in the early morning, planting flowers along the fence in summer, reading late into the night with the window cracked open to catch a breeze. Those moments, ordinary and unremarkable, felt sacred precisely because they belonged to me entirely and without compromise. On one particularly crisp autumn evening, my parents came by with Daniel. We shared a simple meal, the air crisp and golden outside. For the first time in years, the conversation flowed naturally, without the undercurrent of old conflicts. My father made a joke about his woodworking, my mother laughed, and Daniel shared a small story from work. I listened, a quiet contentment settling over me. Later, after they left, I walked through the house, pausing in each room. I traced my hand over the walls, the furniture, the familiar corners. Every mark told a story, my story, but also the story of a family learning to see one another clearly, without assumptions, without entitlement, without the shadows of the past dictating every move. I sat on the porch under the oak tree, now fully grown, and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the fear I'd felt the day I discovered my parents had given my house to Daniel, the disbelief, the quiet anger, the determination that followed. I remembered the long conversations, the confrontations, the careful explanations, and the silence that came after. I understood more fully than ever that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet insistence that your life belongs to you and that others must honor it. The lesson of that time had become a guiding principle. Boundaries create freedom. Speaking your truth, even when it is uncomfortable, builds trust more lasting than compliance ever could. Love that survives honesty is love worth keeping. I realized, too, that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about freeing yourself from its hold. My parents had acted from patterns and assumptions. They had hurt me, but they had also grown. My brother had assumed entitlement. He had stumbled, but he had learned responsibility. By holding firm yet open, I had given each of us a chance to meet reality honestly, and in doing so, I had built a stronger foundation for connection. The house itself had become a symbol of all of this. It was a place of ownership, yes, but more importantly, it was a place of integrity. Every room, every corner, every simple object bore witness to choices made, lines drawn, lessons learned. It was mine, not merely because my name was on a deed, but because I had defended it, shaped it, and lived fully within it. On quiet evenings, I thought about the years ahead, knowing that life would continue to present challenges and surprises, but I felt ready. The experience had given me confidence not rooted in fear or resentment, but in clarity and self-respect. I understood finally that the truest inheritance we receive is not property, money, or status, but the knowledge that we are capable of standing firm, of claiming our lives, and of loving fully without surrendering ourselves. I knew that this lesson would guide me long after the house itself was just walls and wood. It would guide the choices I made, the relationships I nurtured, and the person I continued to become. And as I sat beneath the oak tree watching the light fade over the yard, I felt a profound gratitude for the house that had taught me boundaries, for the family who had taught me patience, and for myself for finally recognizing that my life, my home, my autonomy, my worth was mine to protect, cherish, and grow. That night, I locked the front door behind me, the familiar click resonating like a promise to myself, first and always, that I would live fully, honestly, and unapologetically in the space I had claimed, and that the people who truly belonged in my life would honor that space, not by default, but by choice. And in that quiet, I knew with certainty that I had finally come home. Not just to a house, but to myself.